Welcome to Neon Cobra. Let's kick into it. We are going to be starting a new series. I'm going to steal a name, call it Common Estimate Browser. So, this is something we used at Pax8 for a while. It took a little time to maintain, but I'm hoping to maybe curate some individual examples. The concept is pricing calculators for the more common builds you could experience when you're running an MSP. So we're going to go through a couple of different options throughout the next coming weeks, and we'll caveat what they are, general use cases, and hopefully they form a template for you to get started when you're building within the Azure pricing calculator. Now, if you're using products like Nerdio Manager for MSP, you'll likely use their pricing calculator, but this can still act as a fundamental basis to get started. So with that, we're going to hop over into the publicly facing Azure pricing calculator. So for the first video, we're going to give a little bit of a guided tour, and we're going to talk about a couple of different options and items that hopefully we can reference back, and this can be our table of contents essentially for any future questions that may arise in other videos. So I'll be sure I link this as the originator. So once you log in to the actual website, the first thing you want to do is log in with your Microsoft account. And now the major reason for this is any estimates you create, and we'll see this as time goes on, can be saved and tied to your Microsoft account. So when you're coming back and you're taking a look, you can see previous builds you've done, copy them, export them, make changes. Now, if you're in a non-US country where your exchange rate may fluctuate, the price you see here reflected and we'll take a look at the end, will be at the time you snapshotted the quote itself, which means if there is a large change in anything, whether a new product is adjusted, because we have seen in the past where like Azure Files is removed from storage accounts and then suddenly the quote doesn't look right anymore. But any changes will not be reflected on the heads up display. But once you load back in the quote, those adjustments will occur. So if you need to determine whether there was a large enough fluctuation between time of sale and time of deployment, you can come back in here, open it up, and reference the change. So with this, we'll go back to products. Now, the way this functions is essentially you will search for products and you choose them by, clicking on the little kind of heads up display there, the little icon, and then it will add it to essentially a shopping cart below. So sometimes you'll have to come through and, you can search. I always just type in, general items like virtual desktop to find your AVD line items. So what we're going to build today is just a common QuickBooks deployment for, let's say, 1 to 5 users, right? We're talking really, really small footprint. We're going to try to keep the costs down. This is for a lot of the organizations that can't seem to go to QuickBooks Online for whatever reason, compatibility issues, or just they don't want to be in a cloud model, but you don't want to have a box running in the corner. So this is going to be a quick and easy one where you're going to do a single virtual desktop deployment for 5 users. And we're actually going to leverage Entra ID for this. So we're not going to do any fancy FS logics. We're not going to bring a domain controller or domain services. We're going to talk about just the baseline requirements for a QuickBooks Online. So initially what we were looking at is adding a virtual machine. Now you can build this with a virtual machine and then deploy it as AVD, right? The virtual machine costs for both are identical. The AVD side has a lot more of nuance as far as traveling through, trying to include scaling algorithms and such. For ease of use on this one, I'm going to just use a virtual machine, right? Because we're really going to focus on the compute, the hard drives, and the wrapping services around that. And I want to show you what this looks like. So once we've chosen our virtual machine, the absolute first thing I want you to do is to validate the currency, right? If you are not in US, you need to set the currency. Otherwise, you could end up under provisioning and under quoting an environment. And then when you come to get billed by Microsoft, you'll find that you'll be far off. You can see the current exchange rate as it's snapshotted. So this is generally adjusted at the start of the month. So in this case, we're 1.36 Canadian per 1 USD, and everything will reflect accordingly. The next thing we're going to do is name your estimate. This is how you keep track of things. So we'll call this Neon Cobra. So I usually like to do the name of the company or the client that I'm working with at this point, and then the build. So we'll call this QuickBooks build 5 users. That way, as I save this, you will notice at the top under our saved estimates, we now have an estimate name that we can search for, when it was created, and there's our monthly total. So this is why you'd really want to name items. So from within there, some additional ways and areas to navigate the calculator that we'll likely reference, right? You have the ability to expand and detract or shrink essentially the items you've chosen. You can see high level the virtual machine information. You have the ability to clone this, and that's going to be important when you're doing multiple machines because it will maintain the settings. So once you set like the regions and drive types and all the specifics, you can just clone those out and make quick replications, which is great. You have the ability to delete. So this will be impacting just this line item. You have the ability to expand everything, shrink everything, rearrange if you have multiple services, and then delete the quote outright. So the rearrange is important as you kind of shuffle drives around. I tend to like to put drives as their own secondary item, and we'll go through that in just a moment. So focusing on the virtual machine, the same thing you would do before, you'd actually probably want to name it, right? If you have a very complex environment, we want to ensure that this all lives within there. So I will put QuickBooks server. Right. This will be the QuickBooks server itself. Now we are going to, because it is a small enough environment with 5 users, we're also going to be putting the QuickBooks and AVD together. The idea or the name of the game of this one is to make it as cheap as possible, really to get your toes wet into Azure and maybe even wrap some services around it to make some profit. So we name the services. We choose the region. So personally, I'm going to do Canada Central. Now, the region is very important because it affects 2 things. One, the actual virtual machines you have access to, because not all regions are built the same. And we'll see that in later videos with like GPU enabled units. And 2, it'll affect the price. Virtual machine pricing, really all charges are determined by data center region, because some regions, like if you go to say Qatar or India, might have higher operating costs over there, or lower depending on where you're going, and this affects the price. So we'll choose our region and we'll want to make sure the entirety of everything we do is maintained in this region, and that's where the duplicate button comes in handy. Next, we'll look at operating systems. So we are going to be a Windows-based operating system. The type, this is whether it's just the operating system or whether you want it preloaded with SQL. So in later videos, we'll look at some SQL-based builds, and this is where we're going to action that. Tier of standard or basic. Now, generally, you're going to always be in standard. Basic's going to be essentially just a trial. Nothing's going to go into production. They usually only function on A series virtual machines, which are heavily constrained and limited, right? They are not meant for production. So you're going to stay in standard. Categories. Categories is Microsoft's way to try to bucket or compartmentalize the virtual machines you're going to be choosing. Now, eventually you'll kind of build the muscle where you don't need to come down, and it's actually nice to be able to just to search all the instance series, and you can see what's available in your region just by choosing this. Now, even that can be very difficult to navigate through, especially if you haven't done, or if you already know what you want but you're trying to find. I generally like just to click onto the instance size and then search for, so start typing out what I'm looking for. Now you can do this based on core counts, which is not a bad way to go about it. Tends to limit some of the info you see in there. What I would do is something along this line. So I know I wanted 4 core 32 gig, right? We're going to be loading some services. So I know E4S will bring me into the E series, which has a different core to memory ratio. Now, I have previous videos on how to kind of navigate some of this stuff, and I might refresh it because there's been some later virtual machine decisions that have come out. But once you know what you're looking for, and in this case, if you want more memory intensive or memory dense, the E series are perfect for this. Now I'm going to choose the V5 because, as mentioned in previous videos, the V6s have slightly less CPU power, but slightly more IO throughput. And really, IO is not the name of the game for this, right? You'll find CPU heavy is what we're going to be dealing with for end user experience. Now, next we have the quantity of virtual machines, right? So this is how many of these VMs do we want? I generally do not like to modify this. It's really hard to get lost when you're looking at an individual line item to realize, oh man, that's 4 virtual machines, not 1. What I will edit, however, is 730. So 730 is an averaged month with Microsoft, as in 365 days divided by 12 divided by 24, I believe, right? Whatever the math would be. But essentially 730 is the average day. 744 is a 31 day, month, as in the absolute most this can cost. So when we're dealing with fluctuating costs, you want to get your upper bands, your upper brackets. 744 is that number. So wherever you see a number within a calculator, make sure you're changing it to 744 to assume your maximized costs, not your average costs. Now, this will be a moot point in just a moment as we come down to savings plans and reservations. So I'm not going to dive into this. I have videos that I'll ensure are linked below as to determine what you should be doing. High level, you're going to want to be doing reservations, right? They will maximize the discounts, provide the flexibility you need if you do need to modify things without being stuck into long-term contracts. So you will notice once I choose the 3-year, the hour disappears. This is the assumption is we're not powering this down anymore. This stays on 24/7, right? As a result, you discount and you can actually see your compute costs from 279.66 down to 101.68. So a 63% discount. Now, when this is purchased, this will lock that price in for 3 years. So it is no longer subject to exchange rate fluctuation. But at the time of purchase, if we're in a bad fluctuation standpoint, it will affect that price. So just be aware of that. Now, the second thing is the Azure hybrid benefits or bring your own licensing. Now, because this will be an Azure virtual desktop deployment, we're going to cheat a little bit and we're going to turn on the AHB. We don't have to buy any licensing. You have to bring business premium to the party though, right? Business premium is one of the golden SKUs that provides you the virtualization or the AVD use rights. So this is what you want to log in there with. So just to get pricing where it needs to be, you would mark this as license or Azure hybrid benefit. Now, we'll see in later videos as we go through the pricing estimates. I will also be choosing Azure hybrid benefits in certain options, but that will be prefaced with you have to also buy the licensing, which unfortunately is not included in these calculators. So when you're going through this, ensure that you've also got the secondary parts list outside of the pricing calculator. So we'll talk about that as we get to those videos. Now, overall, the compute and the operating system locked in on a 3 will be 101.68. Now, what you need to do now is you need to add a managed disk. This is essentially an operating system disk. That's the way I've always treated it. So because this is going to be an AVD host and it's going to have users actively working on it, I'm going to recommend a premium disk. Now, because we are also doing an Entra ID join, so this is not a domain join, this is Entra joined, we're not going to have access to FS Logic profile disks natively. And honestly, the complexity to get those added at this point really isn't worth it, right? We're going to be using a bare bones system to get them online. So we have a 256 gig that'll allow for some profile space growth. And then we will add one, and this will add that. Now, what you're going to notice is as we go throughout the calculator, there's the options for snapshots and bandwidth. You're going to find as you're working through these pricing calculators, the same questions will come up over and over. Bandwidth will be apparent and available in most resources you choose. What I like to do is actually exclude bandwidth from that and maybe align it to a network appliance or potentially just its own individual line item so I can kind of keep things clear as I'm going through. But with that, we have our QuickBooks server, our AVD QuickBooks server for 153. So additional items that you're going to require. Assuming there's no on-site access, you're going to require a NAT gateway, right? The NAT gateway is going to be required for them to go external access. And this is as of September, this will be mandatory. So if you don't have any form of firewall, VPN, or anything like that in play, a NAT gateway is the bare minimum to get servers with the ability to access the external internet. So we'll add that in and we'll change that to 744 hours. Now, we don't need to add a static IP address. You can use dynamic on this, right? It is going to flow through the Microsoft servers. So we are good with that. We will add backups, right? We're going to want to protect the virtual machines. Again, we'll choose Canada Central, right? You have the option to do standard or enhanced policies. It really depends on the frequency of churn. We will choose the enhanced policy and it bills by virtual machine and then quantity of data. So in this case, quick and simple, we have a single drive, 256 gigs. We'll choose a generic retention policy, and this is something you should discuss with your client, obviously, to understand, what their expectations of recovery points would be. And then you can schedule your backups. Now, the lowest interval you can do is 4 hours, so keep that in mind. Now, the more you do, obviously, the higher your charge is going to be, right? You'll notice it's pretty negligible at 46, but if you change it to 6 hours and 8 hours, you'll notice just minor adjustments, right? Because the way this functions, now obviously this will compound the more data there is there, but the way this functions is it's incremental based backups. It compares previous backups. So if there's very little churn in the environment, you'll notice very little adjustment to the price. So 4-hour backups aren't too bad. But if you have a very heavy file server, the way it calculates this churn is based on this average daily churn. Now, low, medium, or high is really 2, 3, or 5%. So you can see how this might exponentially grow if you're, say, doing, 2 terabytes at 2%, right? That's 20 gigs of churn a day. If you have, 200 terabytes, you're seeing massive churns. And that's going to cause these storage cost calculations to kind of ramp up and realistically give you a false sense of what your charges might be. Now, this is going to be really hard to actually navigate accurately because there are a few things that, build into this, how frequently the data is being churned, or is it just the same file over and over and over again, right? If it's the same file being touched, very little is going to occur as far as churn in the environment. Profile disks, however, will see a lot of churn just based on naturalized usage and app caching. So that could drive the cost up a little bit as well. SQL databases are very heavy transactional. And if you're doing SQL level backups, because we do have the option to choose the VM types as SQL Server in Azure, you can do MDF, LDF backups, which is a whole different pricing scheme. So likely a video for another day. We are going to choose low churn because, again, these calculators are built for enterprise most times, as in assuming you're going to be seeing massive churns with thousands of people. We're just talking 5 users. So it's going to be low. We're going to choose a zone redundant to provide some localized resiliency to hardware failure or localized, say, floods or fires. We're going to do zonal support. And that is going to give us our Azure backups, likely bloated, but still good to set your worst case scenarios. So with that, the last thing we would potentially consider would be bandwidth. However, I will caveat internet egress through the global network is generally what you're going to be seeing. Your first 100 gigs is free. So even at 150 gigs a month, which is almost 3/4 of the entire data set, leaving that month would cost you maybe $6, right? So I'll add that on there for a little bit of buffer, and you'll generally see this if there's like large archiving projects or moving things out. Your general AVD is going to be roughly 2 to 5 gigs per user per month. So in this case, like worst case is 25 gigs. You'd be in the free zone. So this is what you could expect for a 5-user QuickBooks build. Now, this video is likely going to be a little bit longer than some of the others because we've had to cover some of the items. So with this in mind, we're going to choose save, and we're going to have an actionable quote that can be exported to Excel. You can share it. So this will generate common estimate links. In fact, I will link this in my video comments if you want to get to it, because then you can copy this, save it into your own, and make additional edits. So you almost have a template to start from. So in the end, when you start working with these calculators, there's going to be more complexity, more features you want to add in, but you don't have to get too complex, right? Think down to just your basic levels, understand reservations, understand Azure hybrid benefits, understand really how Enter ID functions. We'll probably cover that again also in a later video. But Enter ID has its limits. And the reason why it works with this is because workstations are able to join to Enter ID for authentication. Servers at this current time are not. So because AVD is a Windows 11 session host, you're able to join and authenticate using your Enter ID. No domain controllers required. Now, the other item for consideration, and I will make sure to maybe do a full-blown edit on this one at a certain point. You may want to put your QuickBooks data on a different disk, right? Let's say we don't want to pile it on the C drive at the root of C, so we want to add another disk. You would come in and add a manage disk, which is like attaching an iSCSI disk. And then you can choose, standard and let's say 128 gigs and call this QB data, right? QB data is where we want to store the disks. You can then rearrange the services, slide that up near the top so it's almost right underneath so they've paired together and saved. And then you want to come back in and modify your data, and we'll just do a 350 average. And this will edit, and you'll have your new upfront costs of $282, understanding that there's some bloat in here, but on average, it's about $60 per user per month to run a full controlled backed up, protected QuickBooks Online server. You can even get a little bit lighter if you want to do remote apps, right? Just publish the application. You could probably get away with less resources, maybe a 2-core 16, right? So have your costs there. But for safety's sake, assuming they may actually log into the environment, a 4-core 32 would be more than sufficient to handle that sort of workload. So that is the first of the series. I'll likely be running this for a while. There's a lot of different regular builds, right? We'll try to standardize around some more CRMs that maybe have SQL requirements. We'll do some graphic enabled units. We'll talk about some more complex stuff down the road. But if there's any particular build or insight you want to see, maybe something that is very catered to your industry, let me know and we can drive something up and get something created. But with that, we'll catch you next time.